jungle took her radio first. That detail matters because everything that came after, every decision Sergeant Ellen Vara made in the next 19 hours, came down to the fact that she was alone, unwounded, and completely silent in a place where silence was the only thing keeping her alive. The mission had been straightforward, the way missions always are on paper. A 4-person reconnaissance element moving through the eastern corridor of the Cordero Valley, cataloging supply routes used by a mid-level trafficking network that had, over the past 8 months, begun functioning with a precision that suggested military training somewhere in its chain of command. Not a kill mission, not even a capture mission. Observe, document, extract. 3 days in the field, back before anyone noticed they'd been gone. Vara had been the team's primary shooter and secondary intelligence collector. She held a record on the qualification range that 3 separate range officers had quietly double-checked before signing off. She'd been attached to the element from a different unit, which was the polite way of saying she'd been borrowed, the way you borrow a tool you need but don't particularly want to own. The team lead was a man named Cassel. Staff Sergeant Danton Cassel, 11 years in, 2 deployments to places he didn't talk about, a jaw like a piece of equipment, and an opinion of Vara that he hadn't bothered to hide from the first briefing. He hadn't said anything directly. Men like Cassel rarely did. It was in the assignments. She carried the heaviest secondary pack, she pulled the longest watches, and when the element moved, she was always third in line, which meant she was eating whatever dust or noise the first 2 kicked up and covering the rear that the 4th man, Trig, was supposed to be watching. Trig was new. She didn't hold that against him. What she held against no one, because holding things against people was a luxury that required spare mental bandwidth she'd learned not to waste, was the way Cassel had looked at her qualification scores and said, "These yours?" 2 words, a whole education in those 2 words. She'd said yes. He'd said nothing else and handed the file back. That was 6 weeks before the Cordero Valley. 6 weeks of training rotations and planning cycles, and Vara doing her job so cleanly and quietly that there was nothing to object to, which was its own kind of problem for a man like Cassel, because he needed something to point at, and she refused to give him anything. The first day in the valley had been unremarkable. They moved well, stayed off the obvious trails, made their first waypoint 4 minutes ahead of schedule. Vara had noted 2 things that weren't in the pre-mission intelligence. A secondary vehicle track running parallel to the main route, recently used, and a pattern of cut vegetation that suggested the network had changed its northern approach within the last week. She logged both. She mentioned them to Cassel at the first halt. He said he'd noted it. She didn't ask whether he'd actually noted it. The second day was when the pattern broke. They were moving to an elevated observation post above the valley's eastern bend when Vara picked up the sound first. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of the sounds that had been there. The birds, the insects, the small ambient noise of a functioning jungle that stops all at once when something is moving through it that the jungle doesn't recognize as part of itself. She put a fist up. Stopped. Cassel kept walking for 2 steps before he registered it. She saw his jaw tighten. Then the shooting started. It came from the ridgeline to the north, disciplined and aimed, not suppressive. They knew where the element was. Trig went down in the first 4 seconds, not dead, she could hear him, but down. The 4th man, a quiet specialist named Oleander, who'd barely spoken in 2 days, took cover behind a root structure to her left and began returning fire on an angle that suggested he knew approximately where the shooters were. Vara moved right. She had the angle the others didn't. She doesn't remember deciding to do it. That's the thing about training when it's been done right. The decisions stopped feeling like decisions. She was simply moving, and then she was in position, and then she was acquiring targets, and in the next 40 seconds, she neutralized 2 shooters on the northern ridge and disrupted the fire pattern enough that the remaining shooters shifted their attention, which was the opening Cassel needed to extract Trig and fall back south. In the confusion of the withdrawal, the radio went with Oleander. This was not anyone's fault. In the smoke and the noise and the scramble to get Trig moving, the radio went with the man who happened to be carrying it. And that man went south with Cassel, and Vara went right, which was the correct tactical decision because drawing fire in a separate direction was the only way to buy the others time to break contact. And she did that, and it worked. And then she was alone in the jungle with her rifle, her secondary kit, 41 rounds, a knife, 2 days of food, and no way to communicate with anyone. She waited 3 hours at the emergency rally point. No one came. This was also, technically, not outside protocol. If the element had been compromised, if extraction was delayed, if Trigg's condition required immediate medical priority, there were a dozen legitimate reasons Cassel might have chosen to bypass the rally point. She listed them, one by one, sitting with her back against a tree, while the jungle slowly settled back into its normal sounds around her. She listed them, and then she stopped listing them, because listing reasons why something made sense was a way of delaying the question of what came next. What came next was the question she'd been asking herself her entire career, not what happened to her, what she was going to do about it. She had four options: move south and attempt to locate her team, which risked walking directly into whatever had followed them; move east toward the exfil corridor and wait for a scheduled extraction she had no guarantee was still running; move west, deeper into the valley, which was the direction no one would expect; or stay put and wait for a rescue element that may or may not know she was missing. She thought about what Cassel's report would say. Then she moved west. The western approach to the valley floor took her past the secondary vehicle track she'd noted on day one. In daylight, moving carefully, she could read it better. The track was too consistent to be random. Same tire width, same spacing between passes, which meant the same vehicle, or a fleet of standardized vehicles, which meant something organized. The vegetation cuts she'd logged pointed to a staging area somewhere above the valley's western shelf. She moved toward it. What happened in the next 4 hours is the part that's difficult to explain to people who weren't there, because it doesn't follow the logic of a decision tree. Vara did not plan to do what she did. She planned to observe and document because that was the mission, and the mission hadn't changed simply because her team had. She was going to find the staging area, log what she could, and then find a way out. The staging area was a compound. 11 structures, partially concealed beneath camouflage netting, with a vehicle pool on the eastern side and what appeared to be a communications array on the roof of the largest building. She counted 23 personnel over 2 hours of observation. The discipline of their movement told her that at least some of them had professional training. The communications traffic she could partially hear told her they were expecting something. She had no radio. She had 41 rounds. She thought about Trigg, who might or might not be stable, and Oleander, who'd been covering left when she last saw him, and Cassel, who had made a decision she understood tactically even as she sat in the jungle with nothing but time to think about what that decision said. Then she stopped thinking about them because she'd found something she hadn't expected. The compound had captives. She saw them when a guard rotation shifted the access point on the northern structure. 5 people, wrists bound, sitting against the interior wall, civilian clothing. The way they sat, heads down, conserving energy, not watching the door, suggested they'd been there long enough to stop, hoping that watching the door would help. She'd seen that body language before. It had a specific quality that was different from fear. It was closer to arithmetic. They were doing the math on their own survival, and the numbers were not working out. This changed the calculation. She spent 40 minutes working through it, the way she'd been trained to work through it. What do I have? What do I need? What's the first step? What she had: a rifle, 41 rounds, a knife, a compact kit that included a field tourniquet, 2 signal flares, and approximately 90 minutes of usable daylight. What she needed: a distraction, an entry point, and a method of moving 5 civilians through a kilometer of jungle without communications, a team, or a prepared route. First step: the communications array. The guard on the northern side of the compound rotated every 22 minutes. She timed it 3 times to be certain. On the 4th rotation, she moved. She is not going to describe this part in specific operational detail. Not because she doesn't remember it. She remembers all of it, with the kind of clarity that certain experiences burn permanently into the retrieval system, but because the specifics are not the point. The point is that she moved through the compound with the 41 rounds, and she used 16 of them, and when she reached the captives on the north wall, she had 25 remaining, and the compound's communications array had a problem that was going to take someone a significant amount of time to diagnose and repair. The captives were 4 aid workers and a local guide who had been grabbed 3 days prior while attempting to document the network's activity in the southern corridor. One of the aid workers spoke enough English to understand the instruction: stay close and stay quiet. The guide spoke better English than Vara, which simplified things considerably. She moved them out through the western gap she'd identified, back along the vehicle track, and then north and east through terrain she'd read on the way in. The guide's local knowledge of the valley filled the gaps in her map memory. One of the aid workers twisted an ankle on the 3rd kilometer, and Vara slowed the group's pace to compensate, adjusting the route to avoid the steeper terrain on the northern approach. She used one flare at the 2-kilometer mark from the established exfil corridor, timed to coincide with what she calculated was the scheduled extraction window. The extraction element found them 40 minutes later. The debrief happened in stages, the way they always do when something has gone significantly outside the parameters of the original plan. First the medical assessment, then the initial after-action, then the more formal process that involves more people in a room with more questions about the sequence of events and who knew what and when. Cassel's report had already been filed. She read it later when she was back at the forward operating base with clean clothes and a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been made sometime in the previous geological epoch. The report characterized the element's contact with the hostile force, documented Trigg's injury, and the decision to prioritize medical extraction, and noted, in precise bureaucratic language, that the element had been unable to confirm the status of Sergeant Vara following the break in contact, and that a follow-on reconnaissance of the rally point had produced no results. The words were all technically accurate. She sat with that for a while. Trigg recovered. She heard that from Oleander, who sought her out specifically in the days following the debrief, with the look of a man who was carrying something he needed to put down. She let him put it down. She didn't have the energy to tell him it wasn't his to carry, because it wouldn't have helped either of them, and it wasn't entirely true anyway. What happened in the valley happened to all of them, in different ways, and everyone who was there would be working out their portion of it for the next several years. The formal inquiry began 11 days later. Not because of Vara's complaint. She hadn't filed one. It began because the intelligence she'd extracted from the compound's communications array, which the extraction element had documented and transmitted before she'd even reached the exfil point, had been identified by 2 separate analyst teams as consistent with a network operating across multiple corridors over a period of not less than 18 months. The scale of it required an explanation for how it had gone undetected, and the explanation led back to the staging area, and the staging area led back to the compound, and the compound led back to Vara in the jungle with 41 rounds and no radio. The 5 captives had also spoken to people. That was a thing that happened, quietly, through channels that aren't part of any official report. At the inquiry, Cassel was asked to walk through his decision-making at each stage of the contact and subsequent extraction. He did this with the composure of a man who had prepared carefully and whose preparation was completely adequate for the questions he'd expected to receive. What he hadn't prepared for was the granularity of the follow-on questions, the ones that came from analysts who had spent 11 days building a precise timeline and wanted to understand each decision against that timeline. Vara was asked to do the same. She did it the way she'd always done her job, without drama, without extra words, with a precision that was occasionally mistaken, by people who weren't listening carefully, for coldness. Afterward, one of the senior officers conducting the inquiry, a woman whose name Vara had known by reputation for 3 years without ever having been in the same room with her, stopped her in the corridor outside. She said, "You logged the vehicle track on day 1. It wasn't a question. Vara said yes. The officer looked at her for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. Then she said, "That's in your notes. It's in your notes and it's not in the elements report." Vara didn't say anything. "That's all," the officer said. And then, after a pause that had a particular quality to it, "Good work, Sergeant." She walked back to her quarters. She sat on the edge of the bunk and thought about the vehicle track and the vegetation cuts, and the moment she'd put her fist up and felt Cassel keep walking for 2 steps. She thought about the way the compound had looked from the tree line and the way the captives had been sitting against the wall with the arithmetic already done in their heads. She thought about, "These yours?" and all the other versions of that question she'd been answering since she was 18 years old. Then she stopped thinking about any of it. There was a range qualification scheduled for the following week. She would shoot it the way she always shot it. Someone would double-check the scores. She would say, "Yes, those are mine." That part never changed. And she had decided at some point in the jungle that she couldn't precisely identify. Not the decision to survive, because survival had never been in question. She'd known she was getting out from the moment she identified the first guard rotation. She had decided that the only version of herself she was interested in carrying forward was the one that kept showing up and kept doing the work, regardless of who was or wasn't watching. The inquiry closed without fanfare. The network's logistics chain sustained disruptions over the following months that the relevant parties attributed, in careful language, to intelligence gathered during an operation in the Cordero Valley. Cassel was reassigned. Vara stayed. Not because anyone told her to, because she wasn't done.